A police officer is shot and left for dead in a freezing drainage culvert, betrayed by the very captain she swore to serve. He thought the storm would cover his crime. But he didn't count on a retired K-9 sniffing out the scent in the snow. Now, a Navy SEAL has heard the call, and a corrupt police force is about to find out they've woken the wrong enemy. The wind howling in from Puget Sound didn't just blow, it sliced, carrying a damp, bone-deep chill that locals in Seattle called the misery. It was a relentless force that scoured the streets and froze your breath before you could exhale it. It was a late Tuesday in January, and the city was locked in the iron grip of a cold snap. The thermometer hovered just below freezing, rendering the industrial district along the waterfront desolate and ghostly under the amber glow of sputtering streetlights. A fine, persistent drizzle danced in the frigid air, coating the gray concrete in a slick, glistening sheen that hissed underfoot, the only rhythm in the vast emptiness. Jackson Jax Ryder, a man built with an imposing frame and broad shoulders that seemed to carry an invisible weight, moved through this icy landscape with a stride that was both powerful and disciplined, steam rising from his body like smoke from a dying fire. He was 34. Though his eyes, a piercing steel blue that had seen too much of the world's dark side, made him look older, etched with the quiet, weary vigilance of a Navy SEAL currently on a mandatory administrative leave. He wasn't running for fitness. He was running to exhaust the demons that came with the silence of civilian life, trying to outpace the memories of arid deserts and the chaotic noise of battle that still echoed in his mind whenever the world got too quiet. Pacing alongside him, matching his rhythm with an easy grace, was Kodiak, a massive German shepherd whose sable coat blended perfectly into the night. Kodiak was 5, a retired military working dog with intelligent, amber eyes that missed nothing. His ears swiveled constantly like radar dishes, tuning into frequencies the human ear could never perceive. To anyone else, Kodiak was just a dog. But to Jax, he was an anchor. The only living thing who truly understood the language of silence and survival, a brother in arms who'd pulled him from the rubble in Kandahar and now pulled him out of bed each morning when the depression threatened to take hold. They moved as a single unit, a silent partnership forged in fire and bonded in the frost of this lonely city. The rhythmic slap of Jax's running shoes and the soft click of Kodiak's claws on the pavement were the only sounds breaking the winter stillness until they reached a particularly desolate stretch near the old water treatment plant, where the smell of the frigid sound water mingled with the metallic tang of industrial decay. Suddenly, Kodiak broke formation, his body going rigid as he skidded to a halt near a rusted chain-link fence that separated the path from a steep concrete embankment leading down to a storm drain. He didn't bark. Kodiak was trained better than that, but a low growl rumbled deep in his chest, the fur along his spine standing up in a jagged line. Jax stopped instantly, his breath pluming in the air as he turned to his partner, knowing Kodiak never gave a false alarm. If the dog was agitated, something was wrong. "What is it, buddy?" Jax whispered, his voice raspy from the cold air, his hand instinctively going to the concealed small of his back where a combat knife was sheathed. Old habits died hard, even in a city that was supposed to be safe. Kodiak trotted toward a large, displaced storm drain cover that lay askew near the edge of the embankment, whining softly and looking back at Jax with an urgency that sent a shiver down the SEAL's spine that had nothing to do with the winter wind. Jax approached cautiously, his senses heightening, the world narrowing to the immediate radius of threat as he scanned the perimeter for movement, but the street remained empty. As he neared the open drain, a foul odor hit him. It wasn't just the sewer rot, but the distinct, unmistakable copper smell of fresh blood cutting through the cold air. Jax knelt in the slush, clicking on the small tactical flashlight he always carried, and aimed the beam down into the drain's darkness. At the bottom of the shallow pit, lying half submerged in the frigid muck and gray snowmelt, was a body. It was a woman, her dark hair matted with blood and grime, her skin as pale as moonlight against the dark filth of the culvert. She was in a police uniform, but it was torn and ragged, the heavy tactical vest partially unstrapped, and her face was swollen, bearing the brutal marks of a severe beating. This was Madison Maddie Grant, a woman Jax didn't know yet, but whose resilience was apparent even in her unconscious state. She wasn't a large woman, maybe in her late 20s, but the calluses on her hands and the set of her jaw suggested a fighter who hadn't gone down easy. Jax didn't hesitate. He dropped into the drain, the icy water instantly soaking through his shoes, ignoring the freezing shock as he knelt beside her, his fingers pressing against the carotid artery in her neck, searching for the drumbeat of life. It was there, faint, thready, and erratic, fluttering like a trapped bird beneath his fingertips. But she was alive. "Hang on, officer. I've got you," Jax murmured, his voice even and calm, a stark contrast to the adrenaline flooding his system. He began a quick assessment of her wounds, his hands moving with the practiced efficiency of a combat medic, noting 2 gunshot wounds to her lower torso that had been crudely bandaged with strips of fabric, likely by her own hand before she passed out. She was hypothermic, her skin ice cold to the touch, and if he didn't get her warm soon, the cold would finish what the bullets hadn't. As he shifted her gently to check for exit wounds, something metal clattered onto the concrete floor of the drain. He shone his light on it and his heart hardened. It was her police badge, bent and battered as if someone had stomped on it repeatedly with a heavy boot. This wasn't a botched robbery or a random act of violence. The damaged badge was a message, a symbol of betrayal and a targeted hatred. Jax pulled his phone from his pocket, his thumb hovering over the 911 emergency call button, but he paused, his eyes flicking back to the crushed badge and the remote location of this dumping ground. His instincts, honed in environments where trust was a luxury and betrayal was lethal, screamed a warning that this was an execution, likely carried out by her own kind or someone powerful enough to control them. If he made a call on an open line, he could be calling the executioners back to finish the job. Before he could make a decision, Kodiak, who was standing guard at the rim of the drain above, dropped into a silent crouch, his ears pinned flat against his skull, the signal for an approaching threat. Jax immediately killed his flashlight, plunging the drain into inky blackness and grabbing Maddie, pulling her deeper into the concrete tunnel away from the opening, pressing her body against the cold, curved wall. The sound of tires crunching on snow grew louder, slow and deliberate. Not the whoosh of passing traffic, but the crawl of a predator. A vehicle came to a stop just above them on the service road. The engine idled with a deep-throated rumble that sounded like a large SUV. Jax held his breath, gently placing a hand over Maddie's mouth in case she stirred and screamed while he used his other hand to signal Kodiak to stay. The dog didn't move, blending perfectly into the shadows, a silent guardian watching the enemy. A car door opened and slammed shut. The heavy thud sounded ominous in the silence, followed by the crunch of boots on gravel and the murmur of low, agitated male voices. "I told you, I put 2 in her," a man's voice drifted down, rough and annoyed, carried on the wind. "She crawled off like a rat. Check the drain." Jax's muscles coiled like springs, his mind shifting seamlessly into combat mode as he calculated angles. He had a knife and the element of surprise, but he was protecting a critical casualty and had a dog to worry about. The beams of powerful flashlights cut through the darkness above, sweeping back and forth across the snow, the light dancing dangerously close to the rim of the drain where Kodiak was hidden in the underbrush. Jax pressed himself flatter into the muck, the cold water soaking into his clothes, numbing his skin. But he didn't flinch, his focus absolute. One of the lights swept down toward the drain opening, illuminating the spot where Maddie had been lying just seconds before. "Nothing," another voice said, dismissive and cold. "The current must have taken her. She's probably frozen solid by now. Let's go. The captain's waiting." The light lingered for a heart-stopping second, illuminating the bloodstain on the concrete, now being rapidly covered by a fresh dusting of snow, before it swept away. Jax didn't move a muscle until the car doors slammed again and the sound of the engine faded into the distance, leaving only the howl of the wind. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, the white plume of it vanishing instantly into the dark. He looked down at Maddie, her breaths growing shallower, the cold seeping into her broken body. He couldn't leave her here, and he couldn't call for an ambulance that might be intercepted. He needed a safe haven, a place off the grid where he could stabilize her without alerting the wolves who were hunting her. He thought of the old fishing cabin his family still owned a few miles down the coast, a relic of a bygone era that no one paid attention to anymore. It was risky, but it was the only card he had to play. He carefully lifted Maddie into his arms, her weight negligible to his strength, but heavy with responsibility. "Kodiak, heel," he whispered. The dog was instantly at the rim of the drain, looking down with concern. Jax began the difficult climb out of the darkness, carrying the wounded officer toward an uncertain salvation, knowing that tonight, the quiet run was over, and a new war had just begun in the frozen heart of Seattle. The fishing cabin was tucked into a forgotten cove on Puget Sound, a relic of the area's industrial past that Jax's grandfather had bought decades ago. It was a sturdy structure of weathered brick and corrugated iron, hidden from the main waterways by the rusted skeleton of a defunct crane. Inside, floating on the dark water of the slip, was the Salty Dog, an old fishing trawler converted into a living space that, despite its peeling paint, was dry and warm. Jax carried Maddie across the pier, the wooden planks groaning under his boots, while Kodiak ran ahead to nose open the cabin door. The air inside smelled of diesel, old cedar, and the faintly pleasant scent of coffee left over from Jax's last visit. He gently laid Maddie on the built-in bunk in the main cabin, her breathing ragged, hitching sound that filled the small space with the terrifying sound of a life hanging by a thread. He didn't waste a second. He pulled a burner phone from a hidden compartment under the chart table and dialed a number he knew by heart. It rang twice before a gravelly voice answered. "It's 3 a.m., Ryder. You better be dying or buying." The voice belonged to Samuel Doc Peterson, a 72-year-old former combat medic who'd served 2 tours in Vietnam with Jax's father. Doc was a man carved from granite with hands that had been steady under mortar fire and eyes that had seen the worst of humanity but had somehow held on to their kindness. "I need you at the cabin, Doc," Jax said, his voice low and urgent. "Gunshot wounds, bad shape. Bring the kit. And Doc, come quiet. Already got my soft shoes on," was the only reply before the line went dead. 20 minutes later, the distinct sound of a heavy-duty truck rolling to a stop on the gravel outside announced Doc's arrival. The older man entered carrying a battered old medical bag that looked as old as he was. He was short and stocky with a shock of white hair and a face crease like a road map of hard years. He took one look at Maddie, then at Jax, and finally at the blood-soaked uniform. "Cop," Doc noted, shrugging off his heavy coat to reveal suspenders over a flannel shirt. "You sure know how to pick 'em, son. Get water boiling and turn on every light you got. I need to see." The next hour was a blur of controlled chaos. Jax played nurse, handing instruments and holding clamps while Doc worked with a precision that belied his age. Kodiak sat in the corner, his eyes glued to Maddie, a low whine escaping his throat every time she twitched in her unconscious state. As Doc extracted the second bullet from her hip, Maddie's body convulsed, her mind trapped in a feverish nightmare of the hours before she was shot. In her delirium, she wasn't on a boat. She was back at the precinct, standing outside Captain Marcus Thorne's office, the door cracked open. She could hear his voice, smooth as silk and just as slick, negotiating a price for something that wasn't his to sell. "The honor of the badge," she muttered, her head tossing on the pillow, sweat beading on her forehead. "He sold it, Marcus. The thin blue line is black now." Jax wiped her forehead with a cool cloth. "She's delirious, Doc." "She's fighting," Doc corrected, dropping a blood-slicked bullet into a metal pan with a clink. "Infection is setting in fast. I've cleaned and stitched her up, but she needs heavy-duty antibiotics and a prayer. I'm giving her a sedative to keep her under, but her temperature is spiking. Keep her warm, but not too warm. If the fever breaks tonight, she lives. If not," he left the sentence unfinished. He packed up his bag, placing a hand on Jax's shoulder. "I'll leave the meds. You watch her. I'll go erase our tracks outside." As Doc left, the silence of the boat returned, heavier than before. Jax stepped out onto the small aft deck, the cold air hitting his face like a slap. He needed to make one more call, one that carried the weight of treason if he wasn't careful. He pulled out a sleek, black satellite phone, military issue, and extended the antenna. The connection was instantly encrypted. "Commander," Jax said when the line connected. He didn't use his name. "Report, Ryder." The voice on the other end was clipped, authoritative. It was Commander Evans, his CO back in Coronado. "I have a situation. Local law enforcement is compromised. I found a wounded officer who claims to know about a sale. She mentioned javelins, sir." There was a long silence on the line, the kind that usually preceded a drone strike or a denial of existence. "We have confirmation of a theft from the armory at Joint Base Lewis MC Cord 3 days ago," Evans said, his voice dropping an octave. "Prototype guidance chips for the mobile missile systems. If they're in Seattle and this officer knows about them, the rules of engagement just changed. You are authorized for a cleanup and retrieval op. This is off the books, Ryder. You retrieve the assets. You neutralize the threat. We were never there. Do you understand?" "Understood, sir." "And the girl? If she's an asset, use her. If she's a liability, make the call. Ryder, out." Jax lowered the phone, the weight of the order settling on him. He wasn't just saving a life anymore. He was stopping a threat to national security. He turned back inside. The cabin was sweltering. He'd cranked the heater as Doc instructed, but Maddie was shaking violently, her teeth chattering with the bone-rattling chill of sepsis. "No, don't," she moaned, thrashing under the blankets. Kodiak got up and went to the bunk, resting his heavy head on her chest, trying to soothe her. Suddenly, the cabin was illuminated by a sweeping light from outside. Through the porthole, Jax saw the flashing red and blue lights of a police patrol boat slowly making its way down the Sound. They were sweeping the shore. If they saw movement or heard a scream, they'd board. And if Marcus Thorne was as powerful as Maddie's delirium suggested, a patrol boat finding them wouldn't mean rescue. It would mean a floating execution. Maddie's eyes flew open, vacant and wild. She opened her mouth to scream, a hallucination of her attackers looming over her. Jax moved instantly. He didn't gag her this time. Instead, he lay down on the narrow bunk beside her, pulling the heavy wool blankets over them both. He wrapped his arms around her trembling form, pressing her face into his chest to muffle any sound. "Quiet, Maddie, you're safe. I've got you," he whispered directly into her ear, his voice a low rumble. "Kodiak, up," he commanded softly. The big dog didn't hesitate. Kodiak climbed onto the foot of the bunk, curling his large, warm body against Maddie's legs, pinning her thrashing limbs with his weight and warmth. Jax sandwiched her between the wall, his own body heat, and the dog. He could feel the heat radiating from her skin, feverish and terrifying, as the searchlight swept across the porthole, bathing the cabin in a stark white glow for a brief moment. For 3 agonizing minutes, they lay motionless in that intimate tableau, a soldier, a broken cop, and a dog, huddled together in the dark belly of an old boat. Maddie's shivering began to subside, her body instinctively seeking the warmth Jax and Kodiak provided. Her breathing slowed, syncing with the steady rhythm of Jax's heartbeat against her ear. The patrol boat's engine faded into the distance, its weight gently rocking them. Maddie shifted slightly, her hand clutching Jax's shirt in her sleep. Her fever was still high, but the violent shaking had stopped. She let out a soft sigh, burrowing her face deeper into the hollow of his neck. Kodiak rested his chin on Jax's ankle, closing his eyes. In the darkness, Jax realized the call his commander had spoken of had already been made. She wasn't a liability. She was the mission now. And for the first time in a long time, the cold didn't feel quite so freezing. The fever broke as dawn did, leaving Madison Grant weak but lucid, her mind as clear as the sky over Puget Sound after a storm. By late morning, the rain had stopped, but the city was still shrouded in a blanket of gray clouds, the air crisp and cold. Jax had moved them from the boat to a more mobile base of operations, a nondescript panel van that smelled of grease and old tools, driven by a man whose laugh seemed to shake the chassis. They were parked behind the Rainier View Diner, a classic chrome and neon establishment on the outskirts of the city that looked like it had been transported straight from the 1950s. It was the kind of place where the coffee was strong, the pie was homemade, and nobody asked questions if you sat in a booth for 3 hours. This was the rendezvous. Jax helped Maddie out of the van, her arm slung over his shoulder for support while Kodiak scanned the alley, his ears twitching at the sound of distant traffic. "You're about to meet the family," Jax said quietly, guiding her toward the back entrance. "They're not pretty, but they're loyal." Inside, the diner was warm and smelled of frying bacon and maple syrup. In a corner booth far from the windows, 2 men were waiting. Jax introduced them simply. "Maddie, this is Bishop and Wrench. They're the best friends a man could ask for in a fight." Elias Bishop Vance was a powerfully built African-American sniper in his late 30s with skin the color of dark mahogany and eyes that were unnervingly still. He didn't move much, his economy of motion suggesting a man who could wait for days for a single second of opportunity. Sitting across from him was Leo Wrench Kowalski, a stocky Polish-American with grease-stained knuckles and a grin that took up half his face. Wrench was the team's mechanic and demolitions expert, a man who could fix an engine with a hairpin or level a building with a chemistry set, all while cracking jokes. "Pleasure to meet you, officer," Wrench said, pushing a mug of coffee toward her. "Jax said you were tough. Anyone who can crawl through a Seattle storm drain in January gets a free pass in my book." Bishop just nodded, a slow, solemn acknowledgement that felt heavier than any handshake. "We got your back," he said, his voice a low rumble of thunder that vibrated through the table. Maddie wrapped her hands around the warm mug, feeling a sudden, intense sense of safety she hadn't felt in days. These men weren't just soldiers. They were a brotherhood bound by a code that transcended uniforms and orders. "The evidence," she began, her voice hoarse but steady, "it's not at the precinct. I knew Marcus would toss my desk the second he suspected me. I put the flash drive in a rental locker at King Street Station. Locker 404. It's in my gym bag." She looked down at the table, her hands trembling slightly. "It has everything. The manifests, the buyer's name, audio recordings of Thorne negotiating the sale of the Javelins. It proves he's selling American missiles to a separatist group overseas." The weight of her words hung in the air, silencing even Wrench for a moment, but the quiet was broken by the diner's television mounted above the counter. The midday news was on, and suddenly Maddie's face filled the screen. The headline screamed in bold red letters. "Rogue cop wanted, Officer Madison Grant sought for espionage and attempted murder." The news anchor, a woman with a severe expression, read the report. Captain Marcus Thorne held a press conference this morning appealing for Officer Grant to turn herself in, citing a mental breakdown and dangerous ties to foreign entities. Maddie gasped, shrinking back into the booth as if the other patrons could see her through the screen. He flipped it, she whispered, tears of frustration welling up. He's calling me the traitor. My father was a cop. My grandfather was a cop. He's burying my name. Jax reached across the table, his hand covering her trembling ones. His grip was firm, grounding her. The news cycle is 24 hours, Maddie. Honor is a lifetime. We get that drive. We clear your name, and we bury him. Bishop turned his gaze from the TV to Maddie, his expression hardening. They control the narrative because they have the microphone. We change the narrative when we bring the truth to light. King Street Station. That's the target. The plan came together quickly, sketched on a napkin with military precision. The station would be crowded, a hub of commuters and tourists, the perfect cover for an extraction, but also a security nightmare. No firearms, Jax ordered, his tone leaving no room for argument. Too many civilians. If we start a gunfight in a train station, we lose the moral high ground, and we confirm their narrative that we're terrorists. We do this quiet. We do this clean. An hour later, they were walking into the grand hall of King Street Station. The sheer scale of the place was breathtaking with its soaring coffered ceiling and massive columns that evoked the majesty of a Roman temple. Thousands of people moved across the marble floors, a river of coats and suitcases. Jax, in a nondescript ball cap and a heavy jacket, moved through the crowd with Kodiak heeling tightly at his left leg. The dog now wore a service vest, looking every bit the professional working animal, which allowed them to pass through security without a second glance. Bishop had taken up a position on the mezzanine level, leaning against a railing like a bored tourist, his eyes scanning the crowd for threats. Wrench was near the exits, pretending to fix a vending machine, ready to create a diversion if things went sideways. Maddie stayed in the van outside monitoring police channels. She was too recognizable to go inside. Approaching the lockers, Jax murmured into his lapel mic. Crowd is thick. Good cover. He reached the bank of lockers located in a less trafficked corridor near the Amtrak waiting area. He scanned the barcode Maddie had given him and locker 404 popped open with a mechanical click. There, tucked inside a worn gym bag, was the silver flash drive. He grabbed it instantly, slipping it into an inner pocket. Package secured, he whispered, moving to withdraw. But as he turned to leave, the hair on the back of his neck stood up. Kodiak let out a low, menacing growl, pressing his body against Jax's leg. 3 men were approaching from the end of the hall. They weren't in police uniforms, and they didn't walk like commuters. They wore expensive wool coats that didn't quite hide the bulk of body armor beneath, and their eyes were locked on Jax. Mercenaries. Thorne had hired private contractors, men who wouldn't hesitate to kill in a crowd if the price was right. Bishop, I've got company, Jax said, keeping his voice calm. 3 tangos, 6 o'clock. Private mercs, by the look of it. I see them, Bishop's voice crackled in his ear. 2 more closing from the north entrance. You're boxed in. You can't come out the main way. The lead mercenary, a man with a scar running through his eyebrow, quickened his pace, reaching inside his coat. Jax knew if the man pulled a gun, panic would erupt. He had to end this before it started. He stepped into the path of a passing tour group, using them as a human shield to close the distance without drawing attention. When the group turned away, Jax was suddenly face to face with the lead merc. The man smirked, opening his mouth to speak, probably to make a threat, but Jax moved with the explosive speed of a striking cobra. He grabbed the man's lapels and drove a powerful palm heel strike into his solar plexus. The blow was short and brutal, stealing the man's breath instantly. As the man doubled over, Jax spun him around, slamming his head into the metal lockers with a thud that was masked by the station announcements. The other 2 mercenaries charged. Kodiak, get him. Jax ordered, pointing at the man on the left. The German Shepherd launched like a furry missile, clamping his jaws onto the merc's forearm. The man screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the screech of an arriving train on the nearby platform. Kodiak dragged the man to the ground, standing over him with bared teeth, daring him to move. The third merc hesitated, his hand twitching toward his holster. Jax closed the distance, using a Krav Maga technique to trap the man's arm, twisting hard until the shoulder joint popped. He swept the man's legs out from under him, sending him crashing to the marble floor. Stay down, Jax hissed, his face inches from the mercs. Tell Thorne his dogs need better training. Police are moving in, Maddie's panicked voice came over his earpiece. Uniforms are coming from the East Wing. Someone must have reported the scuffle. Get out of there now. Jax gave a sharp whistle, and Kodiak released his prisoner, trotting back to Jax's side instantly. They melted into a crowd of commuters hurrying toward the departing train, vanishing into the sea of people just as two uniformed officers rounded the corner to find three men groaning on the floor. Jax moved quickly toward a service exit Wrench had propped open. Stepping out into the cold air of a loading dock where the van was waiting, engine idling, he slid the door shut behind him, breathing hard but unharmed. He pulled the flash drive from his pocket and held it up. "We got it," he said, looking at Maddie. She was staring at the monitor, the dried tears on her cheeks replaced by a look of fierce determination. The team was safe. The evidence was secure, and for the first time, the ghosts of the past didn't seem so menacing. They had the truth, and they were ready to go to war. The safe house Wrench had secured was a decommissioned fire station on the edge of the industrial district, a brick fortress that smelled of old diesel and cold ash. Outside, the Seattle winter had deepened, the temperature dropping until the air felt brittle. But inside, the tension was hot enough to blister paint. Ghost, the team's tech specialist, sat hunched over a bank of monitors, his fingers flying across a backlit keyboard. Ghost was a wiry man in his early 40s with thick glasses and a nervous energy that only settled when he was looking at code. He was a former NSA analyst who'd traded his security clearance for a conscience years ago. "It's a rotating cipher," Ghost muttered, rubbing his tired eyes. "Military grade. Thorn didn't build this himself. He bought it. I can see the files, the names, the bank accounts, the shipping manifests, but they're locked behind a biometric root key. Without the password, this drive is a very expensive paperweight. If I force it, the data self-erases." Maddie stood behind him, staring at the screen, her reflection pale and ghostly against the scrolling code. She knew there was only one person who could have root access without tripping alarms, a man who had been the precinct's moral compass long before Marcus Thorn had turned it into a marketplace for corruption. "Sergeant Miller," Maddie said, the name tasting like hope and fear. "He was the systems administrator before they pushed him into semi-retirement. He taught me everything I know about being a cop. If anyone has a back door, it's him." Sergeant Frank Tom Miller was a relic of a bygone era. A 60-year-old patrol sergeant with bad knees from years on the beat and a heart that still believed in the sanctity of the badge. He was the kind of man who shined his shoes every morning and knew the name of every shop owner on his route. Maddie picked up the burner phone, her hand trembling slightly as she dialed the number she'd known by heart since she was a rookie. It rang 4 times before a familiar, gruff voice answered, sounding tired and weighed down by the past few days. "I was wondering when you'd call, kid," Miller said, his voice devoid of the accusation Maddie had feared. "The news says you're a traitor. I told the captain it was a load of crap. You're stubborn, Maddie, and maybe a little reckless, but you don't break your oath." "I didn't, Sergeant," Maddie choked out, tears stinging her eyes. "Marcus did. He's selling missiles, Sarge. Military hardware. We have the proof, but we can't open the files. I need the admin key." There was a long silence on the line, heavy with the weight of the request. Miller sighed, a sound like old paper tearing. "I knew something was rotten in the department. I just didn't want to look at it. The badge. It used to mean something, Maddie. It wasn't just metal to hide behind. It was a promise to the people who couldn't protect themselves. Thorn turned it into a license for greed." His voice hardened, regaining some of the command tone Maddie remembered from the academy. "I can't give it to you over the phone. Lines aren't secure. Meet me at Tahoma National Cemetery, Section 9 by the Memorial Wall. 1 hour. Come alone. Or at least don't let me see your shadow." Maddie hung up, looking at Jax. "He's in, but we have to move now." While Maddie prepared, Jax sat on a bench near the old firehouse garage, methodically cleaning his weapons. It was a centering ritual, a way of quieting the mind before the storm. He field stripped his Sig Sauer P226, the smell of hops number 9 solvent and gun oil filling the air, a scent that was both acrid and strangely comforting to men who lived by the gun. He wiped down the slide with a cloth, checking the firing pin and recoil spring with a practiced ease, his movements fluid and precise. Next to him lay an M4 carbine, disassembled to its receiver components. Kodiak sat on his haunches a few feet away, watching Jax's hands with an intense focus, his amber eyes tracking every motion of the reassembly. The dog sensed the shift in his owner's energy. The quiet sorrow of the runner was gone, replaced by the cold, sharp edge of the warrior. Jax slid the bolt carrier group back into the upper receiver of the rifle with a sharp, metallic click that echoed in the vast space. He looked at the dog. "Time to go to work, Kodiak," he said softly. The dog stood and shook himself, the jingle of his collar the only sound of dissent against the grim preparation. This technical preparation wasn't just maintenance. It was a warrior's prayer, a plea to the god of mechanics that when the moment came, the machine would not fail the man. Tahoma National Cemetery was a vast landscape of rolling white hills dotted with thousands of identical white stone markers that stood in silent formation like an eternal army. The snow lay undisturbed, a pristine blanket covering the resting places of heroes from wars long past. The sun was setting, casting long, bruised shadows across the snow as Jax, Bishop, and Maddie approached Section 9. They'd left the van a mile back. Bishop had split off to find a high point in a bell tower overlooking the memorial while Jax and Kodiak moved through the tree line, using the massive oaks for cover. Maddie walked alone up the main path, her breath pluming in the cold air, her hand slightly raised to show she was unarmed. She spotted Miller standing by the black granite memorial wall, a lone figure in a long coat, his back to her. He looked small against the vastness of the dead, a lonely sentinel waiting for his last watch. "Sergeant," Maddie called softly, stopping 10 yards away. Miller didn't turn. His posture was rigid, unnatural. "Don't come any closer, Maddie," Miller's voice was strained, choked with pain and fear. "I'm sorry. They were waiting at my house. They threatened my granddaughter. I didn't have a choice." Jax, watching through his scope from the tree line, saw the glint of a tripwire running from Miller's coat to the granite wall. "It's a trap," Jax hissed into his comms. "Maddie, get back." But it was too late. Floodlights blazed to life from the perimeter of the cemetery, turning the dusk into a harsh, artificial noon. Marcus Thorne's voice boomed from a speaker hidden in the trees, slick and mocking. "A touching reunion. I knew you'd reach out to the old man, Maddie. Sentimentality is your weakness." Miller slowly turned. His coat fell open, revealing a horrific sight. He was strapped into a vest packed with C4 explosives, and a grenade was taped to his chest, the pin pulled, held in place only by his trembling hand. "He wants the drive, Maddie," Miller yelled, tears freezing on his cheeks. "He said he'd let you go if you gave it up, but he's lying. He'll kill us all." Jax broke cover, raising his rifle, but he couldn't take the shot. A bullet would drop Miller, and his hand would release the grenade spoon, detonating the vest. Kodiak growled, sensing the impossible dilemma. Thorne's voice laughed, "Throw the drive on the ground, and I won't turn the sergeant into a pink mist. You have 10 seconds. Miller looked at Maddie, and in that moment, the fear vanished from his eyes, replaced by a steely resolve Maddie had seen 1,000 times on the streets. He straightened his back, reclaiming his dignity one last time. "The password," Miller yelled, his voice echoing across the silent graves. "The password is Semper Fidelis 1971. Remember it. Clear my name." "No." Maddie screamed. But Miller was already moving. He didn't run toward Maddie. He turned and sprinted with surprising speed toward the tree line where Thorne's voice had come from, toward the hidden mercenaries. "Get down!" Jax roared, tackling Maddie into the snow behind a marble tomb. Kodiak leapt over them, shielding them with his body. Miller released the grenade lever as he threw himself into the brush where the mercs were advancing. "For the badge!" he screamed. The explosion was deafening. A clap of thunder that shook the ground and shattered the silence of the dead. A massive fireball erupted, tearing through the trees and creating a shockwave that sent snow raining from the branches 100 yards away. Debris rained down on Jax and Maddie. Dirt, stone, and the heartbreaking fragments of a good man. The blast had decimated the flank of mercenaries, creating a chaotic opening. "Move! Go now!" Jax yelled, hauling a stunned and sobbing Maddie to her feet. Bishop's rifle began to bark from the bell tower, providing covering fire as Jax, Maddie, and Kodiak sprinted through the smoke and snow, leaving behind the crater that marked the final resting place of a true hero. They had the key, but the cost had been paid in blood, and the weight of it threatened to crush them as they vanished into the winter night. The safe house was a decommissioned industrial salt storage facility on the south edge of the city, a cavernous structure of corrugated steel and reinforced concrete that seemed to disappear into the whiteout of the blizzard raging outside. Inside, the air was cold, smelling of old dust and the ozone tang of overworked electronics. But it was a sanctuary compared to the violent chaos they'd left behind at the cemetery. The silence in the room was heavy, a physical weight pressing down on Jax, Maddie, and the rest of the team. It was the suffocating quiet that always follows the death of a good man. Sergeant Miller was gone, his life extinguished in a flash of fire and defiance to buy them time, and the price of their survival was etched in every line of Maddie's face. She sat on a crate near a kerosene heater, staring at the concrete floor, her hands still streaked with soot and dirt, trembling not from the cold but from the adrenaline crash and the crushing grief of losing the only father figure she had left on the force. Kodiak, sensing the thick blanket of sorrow in the room, lay at her feet, his chin on his paws, his amber eyes fixed on her with an unwavering, soulful intensity. The dog understood loss. He'd seen empty bunks in the barracks and heard taps played one too many times. He knew this was a time for stillness. Jack stood by a frosted window, watching the snow swirl in the perimeter floodlights, his reflection ghostly in the glass. He felt the familiar burn of anger deep in his chest, the cold, directed rage of a warrior who'd watched innocence be sacrificed for greed. But undirected rage was useless. He turned to the team. Bishop was cleaning his rifle with slow, methodical, almost meditative movements in the corner while Wrench and Ghost were huddled around a bank of monitors set up on a folding table. Ghost, the nervous tech expert, was typing furiously, the blue light of the screens reflecting in his thick glasses. "We can't just sit here and mourn him," Jack said, his voice low, but it cut through the silence like a knife. "Miller didn't die so we could hold a wake in a warehouse. He died to give us the key. We need to turn that key and end this." Maddie looked up, her eyes red-rimmed but hardening. "Marcus thinks he's won," she said, her voice hoarse. "He thinks destroying the messenger destroys the message." "Then let's prove him wrong," Jax replied, moving to the table. "Ghost, what's the status on the drive?" Ghost pushed his glasses up his nose. "The password," Miller yelled, "Semper Fidelis 1971. It worked. The drive is open. It's all here, Jax. The whole ledger. Thorne wasn't just selling to separatists. He's selling the entire stolen lot tonight to a private military contractor operating in the Middle East. They want the guidance chips to bypass Iron Dome systems. This is treason, plain and simple." Wrench slammed a fist on the table. "If we send this to the FBI now, they'll wrap it in red tape for a week. By the time they get a warrant, Thorne will be gone and those missiles will be on a container ship." Jax nodded. He knew the bureaucracy of justice was too slow for the speed of war. "We're not sending it to the FBI. We're sending it to Thorne." The plan was a high-stakes gamble of psychological warfare, the kind he'd used to flush insurgents out of the mountains of Kandahar. They would use the digital ghost of a dead man to haunt the living traitor. "Ghost, can you spoof a signal from Miller's personal cloud account?" Jax asked. "Make it look like a dead man's switch." Ghost cracked his knuckles, a thin smile touching his lips. "I can make it look like it's coming from inside his own house. I'll set up a delayed transmission. We'll send a message to Thorne's personal burner phone, the one listed in these files. We'll tell him the encryption key was automatically uploaded to the FBI's Chicago field office server when Miller's heart stopped with a 2-hour processing delay." Jax nodded. "Panic makes people sloppy. If he thinks the feds are coming in 2 hours, he won't go to ground. He'll try to move the merchandise immediately. He has to get it into international waters before the imaginary net closes." While Ghost set the trap, Jax went to Maddie. She had picked up an M4 carbine Wrench had laid out, holding it awkwardly, the weapon foreign in hands used to a police-issue Glock. "You're not a cop tonight, Maddie," Jax said gently, stepping into her personal space. "Tonight, you're an operator. And if you hesitate, you die." He reached out, his large hands covering hers on the weapon, adjusting her grip. "Elbows in. Don't fight the recoil. Ride it. This isn't about law enforcement. This is about suppression and survival." He guided her body into a proper firing stance, his chest brushing against her back, his voice a low rumble by her ear. It wasn't romantic, but it was intensely intimate, a transfer of lethality and trust. "Miller gave you a chance," he whispered, feeling the tension in her shoulders. "Don't waste it on guilt. Use the anger. Focus it down the barrel. That's how you honor him." Maddie took a deep, shuddering breath. The smell of gun oil and Jax's subtle scent of pine and wood smoke filled her senses, grounding her. She nodded, her grip on the rifle tightening, her stance solidifying. She was transforming, shedding the skin of the victim and putting on the armor of the avenger. Jack stepped back to check his own gear. Maddie sat down, the weight of the rifle comfortable on her lap. Kodiak, who had watched the training session with keen interest, got up and went to her. This time he didn't nudge her hand for a pet. Instead, he rummaged through a pile of gear Wrench had dumped on the floor and emerged with a ragged, slobber-soaked tennis ball, his most prized possession, a veteran of 1,000 games of fetch. He dropped the wet, dirty ball directly into Maddie's lap, then sat back and gave a soft woof, his tail thumping once on the floor. It was such a pure, uncomplicated gesture of love that it broke through the ice around Maddie's heart. He was sharing his joy to heal her pain. Maddie picked up the ball, the tears finally coming, but this time they were tears of release. She buried her face in Kodiak's thick fur, hugging his massive neck. "Thanks, buddy," she whispered. Kodiak licked the salt from her cheek. A silent promise that he was there and he wasn't going anywhere. He took the bait. Ghost's shout broke the moment. Thorn just activated his encrypted comms. He's summoning his security teams. I'm tracking a massive spike in cell activity near the waterfront. He's panicking. He's ordering the shipment to be moved up. The exfil is happening now. Jax moved to the map on the wall. Where? Ghost typed rapidly, triangulating the signals. Pier 5. It's a private shipping terminal owned by a shell company in the files. It's isolated, has deepwater access, perfect for a quick loadout. Jax grabbed his body armor. The rip of Velcro sounded like a gunshot. Bishop, you've got Overwatch. Wrench, prep the van. We hit them hard and fast. No prisoners, no mercy. We're the cleanup crew. Maddie stood up, wiping her face, the tennis ball tucked securely in a pocket. She racked the charging handle of the M4, the metallic click sounding final and decisive. She looked at Jax, her eyes clear and cold as the winter sky. Let's go get him, she said. Jax nodded, a flicker of pride in his eyes. The grieving daughter was gone. The warrior had arrived. They moved out into the snow, Kodiak taking the lead. The storm outside was nothing compared to the one they were about to bring to Marcus Thorn's doorstep. Pier 5 was a desolate stretch of concrete and steel jutting into the black waters of Puget Sound, a place where the industrial heartbeat of the city slowed to a frozen crawl. The rainstorm had intensified, turning the world into a churning gray vortex that reduced visibility to a few yards, masking the approach of the black van that slid silently to a stop behind a stack of rusted shipping containers. Jackson Ryder stepped out first, his breath invisible in the wind, his silhouette instantly swallowed by the shadows. He was in full tactical gear now, the charcoal gray body armor and helmet making him look less like a man and more like a winter wraith. Kodiak leapt down beside him, his paws making no sound on the snow-dusted asphalt, his service vest now fitted with a small tactical camera and an infrared strobe. The dog shook the snow from his coat, his body coiled and vibrating with the anticipation of the hunt. Maddie followed, her M4 held tight against her chest, her eyes wide as she took in the maze of containers stacked like monolithic tombs around them. "Comms check," Jax whispered, his voice coming through clearly on the bone conduction earpiece Maddie wore. 5 by 5, Bishop's deep voice replied. Bishop and Wrench had split off, moving like ghosts toward the towering gantry crane that loomed over the pier like a skeletal giant. They would be the eyes in the sky, raining down suppression from 200 feet up. "We're in position," Bishop confirmed moments later. Thermals show 20+ heat signatures near the water. They're loading crates onto a hydrofoil. Armed guards at every intersection. Jax looked at Maddie, his face obscured by a balaclava that revealed only those piercing blue eyes. "It's time, Maddie. Stay on my hip. If I move, you move. If I stop, you freeze. Don't engage unless you have a clear target and no other option. We're ghosts until we decide to be thunder." They moved into the labyrinth. Jax led the way, his movements fluid and predatory, flowing from one patch of darkness to the next. He used only hand signals, a silent language of warfare that Maddie had practiced in the warehouse but now had to execute with life or death precision. A raised fist meant stop. A flat hand cutting through the air meant enemy ahead. 2 fingers pointing to his eyes meant watch. They advanced through the canyons of corrugated steel, the wind howling through the gaps and masking the soft crunch of their boots. At an intersection of containers, Jax raised his fist. He peeked around the corner, then pulled back, signaling for Maddie to look. 20 yards away, standing under the halo of a halogen work lamp, were 2 men guarding a forklift. One was a private contractor, heavily armed. The other wore the dark blue parka of the Seattle Police Department. Maddie's breath caught. She recognized the profile. Officer Riley, a man she'd shared donuts with in the break room, a man who had shown her pictures of his new baby daughter. Now he was holding an assault rifle, guarding a shipment of stolen missiles for a trader. The betrayal felt like a physical punch to her gut. "I know him," Maddie whispered, her voice trembling over the comms. He's one of us." Jax put a hand on her shoulder, his grip iron firm. "He was one of us," Jax corrected, his voice devoid of emotion. "Now he's a combatant facilitating an act of treason. If he raises his weapon at you, he's made his choice. You have to make yours." He didn't give her time to dwell on it. He signaled to Kodiak. The dog crept forward, low to the ground, blending perfectly with the dark, wet pavement. Jax picked up a loose bolt from the ground and tossed it with a clatter against a distant container to the left. The guards turned toward the sound. "Check it out," the mercenary ordered. As Riley moved off, Jax and Maddie slipped through the gap on the right, moving deeper into the heart of the operation without firing a shot. They were getting close. The sounds of heavy machinery and shouted orders were growing louder than the wind. They reached the last row of containers overlooking the loading dock. The scene below was a hive of activity. A sleek, military-grade hydrofoil was bobbing on the water, its engines idling with a low growl. Captain Marcus Thorne stood on the pier, screaming orders at a team of men loading long, olive-drab crates onto the deck. Beside him was a man who did not belong in Seattle. He was tall and gaunt, dressed in a pristine white wool coat that stood out against the grime of the docks. This was Viktor Volkov, a notorious arms dealer known to intelligence agencies for supplying insurgencies in Eastern Europe. Volkov looked bored, checking a platinum watch while his personal security detail, a team of elite mercenaries with advanced night vision gear, formed a protective circle around the transaction. "Hurry it up," Thorne yelled, his voice cracking with panic. "The network says the feds are 2 hours out, but I don't trust the weather to hold." "Your network seems nervous, Captain," Volkov said, his voice smooth and heavily accented. "But I agree. Load the guidance chips first. The rest is just scrap metal." Jax tapped his earpiece. "Bishop, you got a solution on the boat's engine?" "Negative," Bishop replied. "The superstructure is blocking the angle. I can take out the guards, but if that boat leaves, the chips go with it." Jax eyed the distance. 50 yards of open ground. "Wrench, we need a diversion. Blow the crane's electrical box on my mark." Maddie raised her rifle, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had a clear shot at Thorne, but her hands were trembling. This was the man who had pinned her badge on her at graduation. "Steady," Jax whispered, sensing her turmoil. "Breathe." "Mark," Jax said. High above them, a small explosion popped, followed by a shower of sparks as the massive floodlights illuminating the dock died instantly, plunging the pier into semi-darkness. "Go!" Jax roared, breaking cover. Chaos erupted. The sudden darkness made the mercenaries yell in confusion, their night vision flaring white for a blinding second. Jax and Maddie advanced, firing controlled bursts to suppress the guards. Bishop's sniper rifle began to bark from on high, taking out the running lights on the boat. "Contact front." A merc screamed. The air filled with the crack and hiss of supersonic rounds. Kodiak was a blur of motion, not attacking recklessly, but moving methodically to flush enemies from cover for Jax to engage. They pushed forward, using cargo pallets for cover. Thorne, realizing he was under attack, scrambled for the boat, abandoning his men. "Hold them off," he screamed. Volkov's personal security detail, realizing this was not a police raid but a surgical assault, moved with deadly efficiency. They didn't panic. They counterattacked. A team of 3 mercs closed in from the right, moving through the shadows to cut off Jax's advance. Kodiak stopped mid-stride, his ears swiveling. He barked once, a sharp, warning sound, and looked to the right. Jax saw them a second too late. "Right flank. Maddie. Cover!" he yelled, turning to engage. But one of the mercs already had a bead on Maddie, who was exposed while reloading. A laser sight danced on her chest. There was no time for Jax to aim, no time for Maddie to move. But Kodiak was faster than human reaction. The German Shepherd launched from a crouch, a 60-pound missile of muscle and fury, intercepting the mercenaries' line of fire just as the trigger was pulled. A single shot rang out, clear and sickening. Kodiak yelped, a high-pitched sound that tore at Jax's heart, and tumbled through the air, crashing to the snow. But the dog didn't stay down. The bullet had grazed his hind leg, tearing a gash through the muscle, but the instinct to protect was stronger than the pain. Kodiak scrambled to his feet, blood spraying onto the white snow, and launched himself at the shooter, sinking his teeth into the man's padded arm and dragging him to the ground. "Kodiak!" Maddie screamed, horror washing over her. She brought her rifle up, her hesitation gone, vaporized by the sight of the dog's sacrifice. She put 2 rounds into the mercenary struggling with Kodiak, ending the threat instantly. "I've got him." "Cover the dog," she yelled, moving forward, no longer a timid rookie, but a fierce protector. She stood over the wounded animal, laying down a wall of suppressive fire that forced the other flankers to fall back. Kodiak, panting and favoring his left leg, didn't retreat to safety. He limped to Maddie's side, pressing his body against her leg to steady her, his teeth bared at the darkness, the blood dripping from his flank staining the pristine white snow a deep crimson. He looked up at her, his eyes wild but focused, telling her he was still in the fight. Jax reached them, sliding into cover beside a crate. He glanced at Kodiak's wound. "It's bad, bleeding freely, but it missed the artery." "He's still combat effective," Jax said, though his voice was strained with worry. He bought us a second. We have to use it. He looked at Maddie, seeing the change in her. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, hard anger. She reached down and gave Kodiak's ear a quick squeeze. "Good boy," she choked out. Then she looked at the boat where Thorn was trying to cast off the lines. "Let's finish this," she said. With a limping dog and a relentless soldier by her side, Madison Grant charged into the storm to take back her city. The battle on Pier 5 had dissolved into a smoking ruin of twisted metal and shattered silence. The mercenaries, realizing their paychecks were no longer guaranteed and faced with the precise fire of a Navy SEAL team, had largely scattered or been neutralized. Viktor Volkov, the arms dealer, had vanished into the night on a secondary escape boat, cutting his losses like a cold-blooded businessman, leaving his partner to face the music alone. Captain Marcus Thorn was now a solitary man on a frozen pier, his corrupt empire crumbling around him with every snowflake that hissed on the hot metal of spent shell casings. He stumbled across the slick deck of the hydrofoil, his breath coming in ragged, panicked gasps, his eyes wild. He knew he couldn't outrun the law anymore, and he couldn't outgun a SEAL. But Thorn was a believer in scorched earth policy. If he couldn't have the victory, no one could. He sprinted toward the open cargo hold where the crate containing the stolen guidance chips sat, armed with a self-destruct system he'd installed for this exact scenario. A block of C4 wired to a remote detonator, enough to vaporize the evidence and anyone foolish enough to be standing nearby. Jack's rider saw the desperation in Thorn's movements. He broke cover, sprinting across the icy pier with a speed that defied the treacherous conditions. "Maddie, the crate!" Jax roared over the comms. "He's going for the self-destruct." Maddie didn't need to be told twice. She saw Thorn duck into the boat's cabin, and she vaulted over the railing, her boot slipping on the wet fiberglass. Kodiak, limping but fueled by an adrenaline that masked the pain in his hind leg, scrambled after her, a low growl in his chest like a diesel engine. Jax reached the cabin just as Thorn turned. A detonator was clutched in his hand like a talisman. Jax didn't slow down. He lowered his shoulder and slammed into the corrupt captain, driving him into the bulkhead with a bone-jarring impact. The detonator skittered across the floor, sliding toward the open hatch where Maddie was pulling herself up. "You stupid soldier." Thorn spat, driving a knee into Jax's ribs. "You have no idea what you're doing. This isn't about right and wrong. It's about survival." Jax took the blow, gritting his teeth, and answered with a sharp jab to Thorn's solar plexus. The fight was ugly and desperate, a brawl in a confined space where skill met frantic terror. Thorn was no soldier, but he was a street cop who had survived the worst neighborhoods of Seattle for 30 years. He fought dirty, gouging at eyes and clawing at gear. He managed to push Jax back, pulling a hidden backup pistol from an ankle holster. "Survival," Jax gasped, batting the gun aside just as it fired into the ceiling. "You call selling out your country survival? That's just cowardice wrapped in a paycheck." "Honor doesn't pay the mortgage, Ryder," Thorn screamed, his face contorted into a mask of greed and resentment. "You think the city cares about you? You think the flag keeps you warm at night? I took what I deserved. I built a retirement fund while you were playing hero in the sand." He swung a heavy fire extinguisher from its wall mount, catching Jax in the shoulder. The SEAL staggered, his arm going numb. Jax looked at the man, seeing not a monster, but something smaller, sadder. A man so hollowed out by his own greed that there was nothing human left. "Honor isn't currency, Thorn," Jax said, his voice deadly calm despite the pain radiating through his arm. "It's the thing that lets you look in the mirror. It's why I sleep. And you run." While the two men faced off, Maddie scrambled toward the guidance chip crate. The timer on the explosive block had been triggered by the impact of the fight. A motion sensor failsafe. Red digital numbers were racing down. 0, 45, 0, 44, panic flared in her chest, cold and sharp. She wasn't an EOD tech. She was a patrol cop. She looked at the tangled mess of wires, her hands shaking uncontrollably. "Wrench." She yelled into her earpiece. "I need an assist. It's counting down." Wrench's voice came back instantly, calm and reassuring. "The anchor in the storm, I see it on your body cam, Maddie. Take a breath. Don't cut the red wire. That's a Hollywood trope. Find the power source, the battery pack. There's a yellow lead and a black lead. You need to sever the ground, the black one, but you have to hold the yellow lead to the contact until the circuit drains. Can you do that?"
I don't have cutters," Maddie sobbed, frantically patting her armor.
She'd lost her multi-tool in the chaos. The timer flashed. 0, 20. She looked around desperately. Kodiak nudged her hand, whining softly. He was looking at the wires, his head cocked. Maddie realized she didn't need cutters. She grabbed the black wire, wrapping it around her gloved fingers. "I'm going to pull it," she whispered. "Now." She yanked the black wire free while pressing her thumb hard against the yellow connection. The timer flashed, 0:09, and then the numbers went dark. The hum of the explosive block ceased. Maddie slumped against the crate, gasping. The silence of the disarmed bomb was the sweetest music she'd ever heard. But the silence only lasted a moment. A gunshot rang out from the cabin. Maddie scrambled to her feet, her heart leaping into her throat. She rushed to the door to see Jax on his back, stunned, blood running from a cut on his forehead. Thorne stood over him, panting, gun leveled at Jax's chest. He'd regained his weapon in the struggle. An ugly, triumphant smirk twisted his lips. "You talk too much, hero," Thorne rasped, his finger tightening on the trigger. "You stopped the bomb. Fine. I'll just kill you both and sink the boat. Dead men can't testify." Jax stared up the barrel, his eyes defiant. He had no weapon in hand, no room to maneuver. He braced for the end. His only regret was that he hadn't finished the job. "Drop it." The command didn't come from Jax. It came from the shadows of the deck. Thorne turned, surprised. Madison Grant stood there, her feet planted in a perfect firing stance, her M4 up and steady. She looked nothing like the terrified victim he'd left in the drain. She looked like justice incarnate, battered and bruised, but unbreakable. "Maddie," Thorne laughed, though the sound was brittle. "Put that toy away. You can't shoot me. You're a cop. You follow the rules. You need me for a trial. If you shoot me, you're just like me." He turned the gun back to Jax, betting his life on her morality. "Go home, kid. This is men's work." Maddie didn't blink. She didn't scream. She just exhaled, centered the sight, just as Jax had taught her hours before. Ride the recoil. She squeezed the trigger. Bang! Thorne screamed as his right kneecap disintegrated in a red mist. He collapsed to the deck, the gun skittering from his hand and over the side into the dark water. He writhed in agony, clutching his shattered leg, howling curses at the sky. Maddie advanced, keeping the rifle centered on his torso. She didn't look at his wound. She looked him in the eye. "You were right, Thorne," Maddie said, her voice cutting through his screams like a razor. "I am a cop, and that's why you're still breathing." She moved closer, kicking his other leg out to ensure he couldn't move. Kodiak limped forward, positioning himself between Maddie and the fallen captain. A low growl erupted from his chest that vibrated through the deck. The dog stood guard, his teeth bared inches from Thorne's face, daring him to move a muscle. Jax pushed himself to his feet, wiping blood from his eye. He looked at Maddie with a mixture of awe and relief. She reached behind her back and pulled out a pair of handcuffs, not her own, but a battered, scratched old pair she'd taken from Miller's locker earlier. She grabbed Thorne's wrist, wrenching it behind his back with practiced force, ignoring his whimpers. The metal clicked shut, a sound of finality that echoed across the water. "Marcus Thorne," Maddie read, her voice even and ringing with the authority of the law she had sworn to uphold. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney." As she spoke the words, sirens began to wail in the distance, growing louder, closing in from the city streets. The FBI had arrived, too late to save the day, but just in time to witness the victory. Jax leaned against the bulkhead, watching her. He saw how her hands stopped shaking when the cuffs clicked shut. He saw the dignity she reclaimed with every word of the Miranda warning. She hadn't taken vengeance. She'd delivered justice, and in doing so, she had saved herself. He reached out and placed a hand on Kodiak's head. The dog stopped growling and leaned into his touch. His work was done. "Well done, partner," Jax whispered to them both. The rain continued to fall, washing away the blood and the scars of the battle. But the truth was finally out in the open, cold and undeniable. The judge's gavel came down with a crack that echoed through the heavy silence of the federal courtroom like a rifle shot, sealing the fate of the man who tried to sell his country for a retirement fund. It was a court-martial, a rare and solemn proceeding convened because of the nature of the stolen weapons, held in a windowless room of oak and polished stone that smelled of history and judgment. Captain Marcus Thorne stood in the defendant's box, stripped of his uniform, wearing a drab-orange jumpsuit that hung loosely on his frame. The arrogance from the pier was gone, replaced by the hollow, haunted look of a man who realized too late that he was mortal. The presiding judge, Rear Admiral Sterling, a woman with silver hair pulled into a tight bun and eyes that had seen the strategic maps of 3 wars, read the sentence with a voice devoid of pity. Life without the possibility of parole at the United States Disciplinary Barracks in Leavenworth. As the marshals moved in to cuff Thorne, he looked back at the gallery, searching for a sympathetic face, but found only the stone-cold expressions of the men and women he had betrayed. In the front row, Jack's rider sat straight-backed in his dress blues, the golden trident on his chest catching the harsh fluorescent light, his hand resting calmly on the knee of the woman beside him. Madison Grant wore a black suit, her police shield gone, her face serene. They didn't smile as Thorne was led away. Justice wasn't a game to be won, but a balance to be restored, and the weight of it was solemn. 2 weeks later, the winter chill had finally broken, giving way to the tentative warmth of an early Seattle spring. The snow that had once covered the city in a white shroud was melted away to reveal the green shoots of life pushing up through the soil at Tahoma National Cemetery. A small crowd gathered around a new headstone in Section 9, where the scars of the explosion had been healed with new sod. A flag-draped coffin was lowered into the earth, honored by a 21-gun salute that echoed across the granite hills. Maddie stood by the grave as the flag was folded into a perfect triangle. She watched as the police commissioner, a new man brought in after the scandal, knelt and presented the flag to a young girl with tear-streaked cheeks. Miller's granddaughter, Lily, a bright-eyed 10-year-old wearing her grandfather's oversized patrol cap. On behalf of a grateful city and a proud nation, the commissioner said softly, pinning the Medal of Valor to the little girl's coat. Maddie felt a hand on her shoulder and looked up to see Jack standing there, solid as the oaks around them. He didn't say anything, but the pressure of his hand told her everything she needed to know. Miller's name was cleared. He had not died a traitor. He had died a hero. And now he could rest. 6 months passed, the seasons turning the page from the gray of grief to the gold of healing. The fishing cabin and the dark waters of the Sound were a distant memory now, replaced by the vibrant colors of a suburban backyard in full bloom. It was a late Saturday in June, the kind of day artists try to paint and poets try to describe. A perfect slice of American summer. Jax was on a ladder, hammer in hand, fixing the latticework on the wraparound porch of a modest white clapboard house they'd bought on the edge of town. He wore old denim jeans and a sawdust-covered t-shirt, the tension that had once coiled in his shoulders completely gone. He no longer looked over his shoulder for insurgents or listened for the whistle of incoming mortars. His mission now was simple. Fix the loose board on the third step and make sure the grill was hot enough for the ribs. He paused to wipe the sweat from his brow, looking out into the yard where Kodiak was currently engaged in a dramatic game of chase with a sprinkler head. The German Shepherd, his leg completely healed leaving only a jagged scar hidden beneath his fur, barked with joy, snapping at the oscillating stream of water, acting more like a puppy than a decorated war dog. The screen door creaked, and Maddie stepped out carrying a tray of iced tea and lemonade. She looked different, lighter, the haunted look in her eyes replaced by a spark of purpose. She had resigned from the police force a month after the trial, leaving her badge on the commissioner's desk with a simple note that said, "My watch is over." She hadn't left service, though. She'd just changed her battlefield. She was now the director of the Miller Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to helping veterans and first responders transition back to civilian life, pairing them with rescue dogs who needed a job. "You're going to burn the ribs if you keep staring at the dog," Maddie teased, setting the tray on the porch table. Jax climbed down the ladder, grabbing a glass of tea. "The dog is better tactical movement than half my old platoon," he chuckled, watching Kodiak shake himself dry, sending a spray of water over a bed of petunias. "Besides, I'm retired. I'm allowed to move slow." Jax had received his discharge papers 3 weeks earlier. It wasn't a medical discharge, nor was it forced. He had simply realized, standing in that cemetery, that he had fought enough wars for one lifetime. He'd spent his youth running toward the sound of gunfire, but now he found more meaning in the quiet sound of the wind in the trees and the laughter of the woman he loved. "Did you get the letter?" Maddie asked, sitting down on the porch swing. Jax nodded, pulling a thick envelope from his back pocket. "It came today from the Department of the Navy." Maddie's breath hitched for a second. "Is it?" Jax smiled, a genuine expression that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "Yeah, it's official." He opened the envelope and pulled out a velvet box. Inside was a medal, not for him, but for the soldier who had taken a bullet in the snow, the K9 Medal of Valor. That evening, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of violet and burnt orange, they held a small, private ceremony in the backyard. There were no generals, no news cameras, and no fanfare. Just Jax, Maddie, and a few close friends, Bishop, who had brought a surprisingly good potato salad, and Wrench, who had brought a case of beer and stories that got more exaggerated with each telling. Doc Peterson sat in a lawn chair smoking a pipe, nodding his approval as Jax whistled for Kodiak. The dog trotted over, sensing the shift in mood, and sat at attention, his chest puffed out. Jax knelt on one knee in the grass, getting eye level with his best friend. "Kodiak," Jax said, his voice thick with emotion. "For extraordinary bravery in the face of the enemy, for protecting the team, for being the best damn boy." He pinned the medal to Kodiak's collar. It clinked softly against his dog tags. Kodiak didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. He licked Jax's face, then turned to nudge Maddie's hand. Maddie knelt beside them, wrapping her arms around the dog's neck, burying her face in his fur. "Thank you," she whispered, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. "Thank you for bringing him home. Thank you for saving me." Jax reached out and took Maddie's hand. His palm was rough, calloused from years of holding rifles and climbing ropes, but his touch was gentle. Maddie squeezed back, her fingers lacing with his. They stood up together, watching the fireflies begin to dance in the twilight air. The smell of charcoal smoke and freshly cut grass filled the air, the scent of peace. "So," Maddie said softly, looking at the metal glinting on Kodiak's chest. "What's the mission now, sailor?" Jax looked at the house they were fixing, the friends laughing on the porch, the dog chasing fireflies, and finally at the woman who had crawled out of the darkness with him. He pulled her close, kissing her on the forehead. "The mission is right here," he said. "To live, to build something that lasts, and to make sure the only thing we ever have to fight is a leaky roof." They stood there as the stars began to poke through the canopy of the night. Two warriors who had laid down their swords to plant a garden, the nightmares of the drain and the cold betrayal of the pier feeling a lifetime away. Fated stories to be told in hushed voices years from now. Kodiak barked once at the rising moon, a sound of defiance and pure joy, before trotting back to lie at their feet. The darkness had tried to take them, but they had held the line. And now, under the vast, protective dome of the American sky, they finally had the one thing they had fought for all along, a tomorrow.